Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Robotyne, where there has been yet another Russian advance within the village, as we see with this geolocated footage showing the Russian advance within the village. This means that the Russians have now advanced yet another street, and the Russians are now pushing the Ukrainians towards the northern and eastern outskirts of the village. Fighting taking place in the next street means that the Russians have now successfully secured the southern street completely and moved the front line away from it. And this means that the Russians are now able to launch offensive operations towards the east, where following the Russian capture of the fortifications to the south of the village, they're now able to then push on to the next set of fortifications. Securing the east of the village will allow the Russians to push on to the northern parts, which will be the end of the third battle of Robotyne. So there's still a while until the Russians capture Robotyne, but it is the current trend is pointing towards in this section of the front line. The capture of Robotyne would mean the collapse of the Ukrainian fortifications east of the village, and the front will be returned back to what it was prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive. At the same time as the fighting is taking place in Robotyne, the Russians have continued their fighting by Robotyne, where they've managed to make this advance east of the village. This is from the report mentioned earlier in the previous video today. The Russians launched an armored assault, which didn't really get that far, but they managed to gain control over this area right here. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the south of Pervomaisk, there is this small advance by the Russians, where they've managed to capture this small section of the front line, pushing towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the pocket. We see that based on this, it is likely that the Ukrainians are still present within the fortifications here to the east of Nevelske. After the Ukrainian recapture of Nevelske, the Russians are now pressuring the east to secure the positions east of Nevelske before returning to regain control of the village. This will be the third battle of Nevelske, as the second one ended in just one day, as the Ukrainians managed to recapture it, likely due to a Russian withdrawal. That main reason would likely be that the Ukrainians have fortified positions, which makes it difficult for the Russians to push onwards, especially until they have secured the positions east of Nevelske, while at the same time the Ukrainians do not really face any fortifications of the Russians and are able to heavily bombard the village, which is largely destroyed, which would mean that the Russians would suffer a lot of casualties holding on to it. This is likely why the Ukrainians managed to push back and regain control of it. Slightly north, we have the fighting by Nitailove, where heavy fighting is taking place. According to the latest reports, another Russian armored assault is taking place within the village, where they're trying to gain full control of it, but they're meeting heavy resistance by the Ukrainians, as the Ukrainians are using a lot of heavy artillery and firepower to stand against this Russian offensive. The Ukrainian positions by Nitailove is extremely important for the front line in this section of the front line. If the Russians gain control over Nitailove, they'll be able to secure the southern flank, which will allow them to push towards Umanske and move on to the next line of defense of the Ukrainians, as everything to the south of this area would be under Russian control, and their entire focus would move in a northern direction. The Russians do not have an interest in moving in a southwestern direction significantly. Fighting will take place by Kyslivka after Nitailove, but there will not be a significant force. It will return to a more passive positional fighting, as the front moving onward is largely open fields. It will instead be redirected in a northern direction towards Yasnogrodivka and Umanske, and in a southern direction towards Nevelske and subsequently Krasnohorivka, where fighting continues as we move on to the next section of the front line, which is to the north by Kotlярivka and Kyslivka, where the Russians now have gained full control over Kyslivka. This is a significant development. With the full control of Kyslivka, the Russians can now move on to the Ukrainian fortifications to the west of Kotlярivka and Kyslivka and move on to the villages of Ivanivka and Stepovane Vasilivka as they advance through the railways towards Peshane. This is a significant development in this section of the front line, and it is likely that this will allow the Russians to launch a larger offensive and start a battle towards Kupiansk, as there would be no significant positions between those positions and the next line of Ukrainian defenses, which is the village chain along the Uskil River line. This will be fighting similar to what is happening west of Kremenna in the direction of Terne, Torske, Nevske, Makivka, and so on. Since the start of the year, the Russians have been on the offensive, and in this period of time, which now spans about 5 months and 6 days, today is the 6th of May, the Russians have captured 23 settlements. From the north and going southwards, we have Kyslivka, Kotlярivka, Tabaivka, and Kokhmelny here in the Luhansk-Kharkiv region. We have further south in the direction of the north of Bakhmut, the village of Vesele, the Russians captured that. West of Bakhmut, the Russians have captured Bohdanivka and Ivanivske and are now fighting by Chasiv Yar. Moving on from that, we go south in the direction of Avdiivka. The Russians have captured Arkhangelske, Keramik, Novokalinove, Ocheretine, Solovyove, Novobakhmutivka, Berdishi, Stepove, Semenivka, Orlivka, Lastoshkine, Tonenke, Sheverne, Avdiivka. They've managed to capture Pervomaiske here to the south. They managed to capture Nevelske but has been pushed back, so this will not be counted. To the south, they have managed to capture Pobieda and Novomikhailivka. These are all the 23 settlements the Russians have captured since the 1st of January. If we count the ones from October onwards, we have even more north of Avdiivka in the direction of Kamyanka and other areas here in the section of the front line. With this, we see that the Russians have had more success with their offensive that also has lasted a longer time than the Ukrainian one did last summer. But this shows that the Russians' military capabilities are significant and are larger and stronger and more capable than what the Ukrainians had available during their summer offensive, as the Russians have managed to gain more territory both in square kilometers and also in a number of settlements, as we see with the Wikipedia page, which honestly is well made. The result is a Ukrainian failure. The Ukrainians managed to recapture 14 villages in Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblasts, but fails to advance further. The goal was reached as of C. They managed to make a few dents at the front. We see similar cases here by the front where the Russians have not managed to advance significantly, but here by Avdiivka, what we see is indeed significant, because prior to the Russian invasion, the front line looked something like this. And as we see, the Russians have made a push in two directions. North of Avdiivka towards Ocheretine and west of Avdiivka towards Pervomaiske and Nitailove. So with this, we see that the Russians will be targeting Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka from these two axes. There's no significant Ukrainian defensive positions other than the defensive lines, which are built of fortifications, but there's no cities, there's no villages that are significant other than Ocheretine in the section of the front line, all the way to Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. The village of Ocheretine has opened the road to both of these cities, and this is why we're going to see further Russian advances until they make significant progress towards those positions. Now, on a similar topic, there's going to be significant developments over the next few days. The reason for that is two highlights. The first one is tomorrow on May 7th, which is Victory Day. There's going to be a Russian Victory Day parade, which is the yearly parade the Russians and post-Soviet countries usually do to celebrate the victory in World War II. So that is a major point where the Ukrainians will likely launch some cross-border shelling, cross-border assaults, or generally massive missile and UAV strikes on Russian positions near the border, because that is how far their range goes. The second highlight is the 9th of May, which is in 3 days, which is the inauguration of Putin after he won the election. So with this, we have these 3 days, which are going to have significant developments, and following that, we will see what happens. But there's likely going to be significant developments when it comes to these UAV strikes, missile strikes, and cross-border operations of the Ukrainians in these coming days. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.